Previously, to prove how not a villain he was, Mr. Paxton of Terra Prime used his moon base to take over a death ray on Mars and threaten to unleash it upon the Earth. Now back to the story. Archer tries to block the signal, but this is broadband stuff. All Paxton, all the time. This means that his message can't be stopped, and that Enterprise can't contact Earth. They can't shoot him either. Any serious hits while tied into the death ray risk setting off an explosion so huge it's going to kill a lot of innocent Martian colonists.
Do not be deceived. This is no ordinary innocent child. This is an alien-human hybrid.
That one's a lot cuter than the alien-human hybrid on the X-Files. Paxton makes clear that he doesn't want to see anything bad happen to aliens. He just wants them to piss off back to wherever they came from and leave us alone. If they don't, he plans to shoot Starfleet Command, and as a bonus, he takes a potshot at Enterprise, at just a tiny fraction of the weapon's power. And even that kicks their asses good. To round out the Minister's day, Terra Prime has organized large protests outside of the embassies of the visiting alien dignitaries.
The deadline aside, the fact that Paxton has the support of so many of your people is almost as troubling.
I agree. Earthmen talk about uniting worlds, but your own planet is deeply divided.
Well, let's not be hasty. The loudest in a group are usually the ones who want to pull the rest of the more reasonable ones along against their will. And it's also easy to convince desperate people that extreme action is the only thing that works. To quote from TNG, "You probably can't imagine what it's like to be so lost and frightened that you will listen to any voice which promises change." Well, this is clearly an intolerable situation for Earth's leadership. Paxton needs to be shut down swiftly to demonstrate to both the alien leaders and Earth citizens that this is merely a well-orchestrated stunt by a few malcontents with connections that will be brought to a swift end. But Archer isn't in favor of blowing up the mining colony ship with his own people on board, to say nothing of those colonists. And the minister responds to that by saying, "Oh yeah, it's even worse than that. The array is needed to deal with a bunch of incoming comets. Blowing it up puts all Martian colonies at risk of falling death. But driving out all non-humans or having Paxton take pot shots at the Earth, well, neither of those are acceptable either. Today's really a bad day to be in charge. Though it's probably a worse one to be on Mars. You don't even get a say in this." Speaking of Mars, Paxton allows T'Pol and Tucker to see the baby, and reveals that the child was created using DNA from both of them taken from Enterprise. Even the flagship of the Federation isn't free of Terra Prime members. But after what they've went through, between Archer and Trip going off about Vulcans over the years, to the Xindi nearly destroying the world and hunting down the human race, would you expect that nobody thinks humans would be better off without aliens underfoot? Besides, if even Reed could be a spy in Enterprise, anyone could be. Speaking of which, he's meeting with Section 31 again, but only because Archer told him to. He'd like to find an alternative to blowing up a whole lot of people. It's impossible, of course. The place was set up to avoid people from sneaking up onto Mars, though a fat lot of good that did them stopping Paxton. But Section 31 is here to think of the unthinkable and be prepared for it. So they know that the terraforming has caused the sensors to no longer work as effectively as they used to. But it does require them to find a way to get on the planet first. And hiding in a box and having Amazon deliver them just isn't going to work, not a third time. There's a comet that's going to be coming in soon, so the plan is that Mayweather will be able to fly a shuttle pod in its wake and go undetected. A crazy plan, but at this point, that's exactly the kind of plan we need. Paxton and T'Pol spend some time debating the merits of the baby. Paxton says she exists to be a threat, but T'Pol sees it as proof that humans and Vulcans are more similar than they had thought. At the very least, the naughty bits match up. Enterprise is ready to try their plan, so they swoop in behind the comet, a daring maneuver which naturally requires Mayweather to be down in the brig. He's there to see Gannett. She wanted to see him before the mission to explain she doesn't actually work for Terra Prime. She works for Starfleet Intelligence. They've already figured out that someone from Terra Prime is on board, and she's supposed to snoop him or her out. She can't tell anyone or she'll blow her cover, which is kind of a sentence that is self-defeating, but she's only doing it because she's worried the real Terra Prime operative is going to warn Paxton, or do something else bad, and Mayweather could be hurt or killed, and she's sweet for his bod. We did see those abs recently, so it would make sense. Down on the surface, Tucker has been pressed into service working on helping the laser targeting system. Paxton's #1 minion's keeping an eye on him, and while engaged in chit-chat about the anti-alien sentiment, the guy expresses his theory about the Vulcans, that they did nothing to stop the nuclear annihilation of World War III, so that they could more easily control us. It's ridiculous, of course, but sadly typical, as it's a common human trait, and not in the "it's quite common that other people aren't as smart as I am." Rather, it's quite common that all of us, no matter how intelligent, can accept the ludicrous as truth. To avoid derailing this video, I'm going to discuss the matter in the accompanying one, because all this is complicated.
Okay.
Although not for Trip. For Trip, life is simple. During that, Trip sabotages the targeting system, but Paxton saw this coming, and goes in to explain why he needs to undo that. Starfleet has been warned ahead of time where and when the weapon is going to fire, so he knows that, as a precaution, they'll evacuate Starfleet Command. But with a targeting system like this, it's like trying to draw a straight line in the back of an RV that's on a bumpy road. Instead of the symbolic gesture of the bloodless destruction of Starfleet Command, they'll wind up spraying death all over San Francisco. There's a very strong reason for Paxton to want to avoid the second one, even if he were indifferent to the lives of others, which I don't think he is. But again, I'll get into that in the companion video. In orbit, Mayweather's piloting the shuttle pod in behind the comet, though that's not as easy as it sounds. It's like following a truck full of gravel along a bumpy road. Not only do you have your own problems driving there, but then someone's throwing bits of rocks at you all the time. It's so bad that Phlox has to break out the barf bag for Reed. Though with his personal habits, I'm guessing that Phlox probably carries those around for others for purely pragmatic reasons. As they start to head into the atmosphere, though, the console locks up and the engines shut down. They're out of control. So they switch over to manual piloting, and Mayweather's able to avert the crash. At the last minute, because timing is always important if you want to prove to the boss why you're too important to be downsized. While they head towards the facility on foot the rest of the way, and Trip starts monkeying with things in his cell, T'Pol has insisted that she have a private conversation with Paxton. She wants Paxton to let her, Trip, and the baby go. The baby is sick and needs medical care. And seeing as how the pediatricians have both been murdered, well, they'd have to leave. If Paxton refuses, she'll give away his secret, that he's taking a treatment developed by aliens to treat a condition that would have otherwise killed him decades ago.
I'm not the first significant leader who failed to measure up to his own ideals.
You're not significant.
History will determine that.
That's not just ego. He does have a good reason to think that history's going to spend a lot of time talking about what he's done here. I'll get more into that again in the companion video. He's not scared of her threat anyway. No one in Terra Prime is going to believe that this is true, especially if it comes from an alien. The thing about people who find you untrustworthy is that they don't trust you. The problem is baked right in. Speaking of problems, the Minister is on Enterprise, and with Paxton's deadline being nigh, he's given up on Archer and wants Hoshi to shoot Paxton's mining ship/villain stronghold. She won't do it until the last minute, and when he tries to pull rank, she points out that he doesn't actually have one. She can't be compelled or relieved except by a superior officer within her chain of command. And that would mean the Minister would be dressed like a Starfleet officer rather than the funeral director for Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Archer's team is inside and runs into Trip, who quickly fills them in. And then they storm the control room just before Hoshi was about to blow them all up, so luckily they didn't need to stop for a second barf bag. But a firefight does break out, and the weapon is charged up to fire. Paxton goads Archer by calling Archer's dad a Vulcan patsy, but Archer is too busy shutting down the death ray to get into his daddy issues right now. But during the fight, the window is damaged and finally blows out, so Paxton starts to turn it back on again, and locks it so that it can't be switched off. It fires, but Trip gets to the targeting system first and points it into the bay. Saves a lot of people, but it is going to put the fish down for a while. The baby is brought to Enterprise. You might recognize the Idic that T'Pol hangs up from our recent look at Is There in Truth No Beauty? And proving that sometimes the truth is actually very, very ugly, the word is that the baby is not going to make it. Phlox will do what he can, but it's a genetic condition, and we all know how he feels about curing those. Meanwhile, Mayweather is bothered by what happened with the comet, The engine and the console both failing simultaneously shouldn't be possible, not unless the problem happened right where they both link up. And sure enough, the panel is gone. Sabotage. The first suspect is the guy whose name is on the report, only when Tucker came back from Columbia, he moved some people around, and Massaro got that job instead. Sure enough, he's the actual saboteur, and he ambushes Archer trying to get into a turbolift. Not to worry, this isn't part of some elaborate plan. The kid realizes there's no endgame here, so he just wants to apologize before he takes his own life. I suppose Hallmark doesn't really make a card for that. Anyway, another assembly of delegates is called, where the minister gives the Enterprise crew the chance to finally have the spotlight. Archer gives a speech about how privileged his generation is to finally know with certainty that our species is not alone in the universe. That they are explorers, and humanity wants to do that exploring alongside all of them. Sovil is the first on his feet, showing why this really closes out the series. Since his hot-headed insistence on leaving early, Archer's learned to respect the Vulcans. And since their inexplicably outraged response, the Vulcans have come to respect him. Lord knows why, but they do. The conference is back on track, and although it's just the beginning, the details will take time. And there's another issue that goes unstated, but is likely going to play a part. As for the rest of the closure, Gannett and Mayweather patch things up at least a little. Tucker reveals that, while their daughter didn't survive, that Phlox says the problem was with the technique, not the idea. Future Vulcan-human hybrids should be fine. Assuming they don't have angels messing with their heads, of course, but what are the odds of that happening? Post-episode follow-up. Annoying character goes to Berman and Braga for stealing Terra Prime's thunder, following up the episode immediately with their own poorly conceived fake version ending when this episode was initially broadcast. It was like Kanye deciding to burst in during the last note Nat King Cole was singing in Unforgettable, just cluelessly narcissistic. Final score for Demons and Terra Prime together is 9 out of 10. It's a very strong outing. Montgomery's acting is just about the only performance that lets the episode down. Sometimes his lines just didn't seem human to me. But Weller was on top of his game. Trenier carried a heavy load very well, and even Blalock endowed the two-parter with much more of a natural performance than we had seen from her previously. The episode allows Archer to be the kind of captain we were always told he was but never acted. Concerned with duty, diplomatic, decisive but not pig-headed or unstable, crafty, and charismatic. Hoshi got to go from being afraid of everything to commanding the Enterprise in a moment of crisis and keeping her wits about her in that moment. Phlox has a chance to reflect on how the diversion of Enterprise has changed his life by the relationships that he's formed. Mayweather gets a subplot, and Reed gets his own vital role as the ex-Section 31 agent. It's not perfect, and I can't help but wonder if this was supposed to be 3 episodes instead of 2, because it feels like there's a lot in Part 1, and then Part 2, which does move quickly, is extremely focused. Either way, though, it was a fitting end for Manny Koto's run, putting a final stamp on his season with a high note. But in case you didn't hear me say it 1,000 times, check out the companion video where I explore the psychological aspects on display in this 2-parter. Hope you enjoy that too.
All hail the Overlord! All hail the Overlord!
There are protesters chanting outside the Andorian embassy. And they're using words that aren't in the Universal Translator.